All right. Um, Thanks to the organizers, specifically Joe, Takuya, and then Hilka for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I did just fly in this morning, so I'm a little struggling with jet lag, but hopefully once the talk gets going, that will get me going too. So what I wanted to do today is, I have a pretty ambitious agenda. Let me see how much I can cover. But I want to basically elaborate on this idea on what can we use, what can we do with neuroscience data that can be applied to marketing. And I have a second part in my title, which is this tension between the balance of internal and external validity. Like, what are some of the limitations of these methodologies? At the same time, what can we do to get a good idea of what's actually valuable or realistic in the marketplace so that it's of relevance to people that are going to use this data? I think there'll be a couple of points in my talk when I'm talking about methods where I'll try to pause and emphasize on that point. Some of these slides, Hilka did a great job of introducing it, so I'll go through quickly. So we all know what consumer neuroscience is. Essentially, it's using a variety of different methodologies to get better insights into consumer behavior. This again is something that was touched on briefly, but I like to reiterate this. When the field first started off, and it's probably only about 15 years old at most, if you give it take a few years, a lot of the emphasis was in this direction. In other words, it was basically people in neuroscience trying to take interesting marketing phenomenon and evaluate or elucidate what the underlying neural mechanisms were. So these were things like neural correlates of willingness to pay, neural correlates of liking, neural correlates of attractiveness, a whole bunch of things like that. So that was what a lot of the emphasis was. So it was essentially focused on psychological processes, as evaluating neural correlates, and also understanding a little bit about individual differences and how the brain reacts to those individual differences. This is the part where, as Hilka said, Klaus would ask, so what, right? So if I'm on the marketing side, why do I care? I understand something about how the brain works, okay, but that's not really useful for me. And that's what the effort has been in the last few years, to flip this arrow and now say, now that we understand something about how the brain works and what some of these processes are, what can we contribute back to marketing, right? So these are things, simple things like measuring implicit processes, but moving on to more complex stuff like neural predictions. So taking something from a small group of individuals and predicting what happens at the market level, and maybe using it also as a more refined segmentation tool, like beyond just demographic and psychographic questions. If you understand something about the profiles of people's activations, can you then do effective segmentation using these methodologies, right? So these are some areas where currently the research is moving towards. Like I said, I have an ambitious agenda. So today what I want to do is talk about two studies. The first one, I had to talk about it because it's already been referred to multiple times in the other talk. So I will try to do it quickly, which is essentially the study that we did on evaluating the effectiveness of multiple methodologies in predicting what makes a good ad or an effective ad. And then I will spend the second part of my talk talking about some newer data where we are trying to compare the relative effectiveness of print versus digital advertising, right? So that's what I want to try and do today. So this first study that I want to talk about was sponsored by the Advertising Research Foundation, which is basically a public body in the US, which has a bunch of different members. And these members were the ones who participated in this study. And by participating, it means that they had to share some of their ads, and also more importantly, share up to 2 years worth of time series market data so that we could evaluate the elasticities, or how effective the ad was in the marketplace over a 2-year period, right? So the study went like this. So we focused on 4 different phases. So we used a bunch of different methods, the more traditional self-report questions. We did some implicit measures. We used eye tracking with biometrics, which included skin conductance, heart rate, and breathing. We also did EEG, and finally, we also did fMRI. These are 4 groups of participants, so this was not all simultaneous. So the eye tracking and biometrics were simultaneous, but the EEG was separate, fMRI was separate, but there was a common thread of self-report questions across all these groups of people to make sure that these differences are not driven by differences in the groups itself. We had a very high alpha to show that it's not like people's preferences or attitudes were indifferent across these different groups. But more importantly, like I said, the key is the dependent variable here which is a measure of elasticities, which I'll come to in the next few slides. So how did the study go? So all participants who participate in the study complete a pre-screening questionnaire. This is just to evaluate their basic preferences for advertising and whether they watch TV and so on. And once they clear this, they come into the lab and they go through a protocol which essentially goes like this. So we had a total of 37 ads, and if I had one wish, I wish we had a lot more ads because we would have had a lot more power in that case, but that's the best we had. So we had 37 different advertisements with elasticity data. Some of these were repeat brands, so we classified them as the unique brands, which were 15 unique brands that were shown in the first pod. Then there was a break and we did a recall measure. Then we showed the repeat brands. So for example, something like Orbitz has 3 different ads, and so there's no point in showing all 3 and asking for a recall. Then it obviously have a higher recall. So the repeat brands went into the second pod, and then we did a recognition and aided recall test at the end of it. Within each block, basically an ad plays, they watch the ad, they answer a series of questions, and then the next ad plays, and so on and so forth. All right, so here's an example of one of the ads from the study. And the little curvy lines that you're seeing here is data from ECG, EDA, and respiration. And the important point here, which is very, very critical to understanding the study, is all the data that we evaluate or present in the study is aggregated across the whole 30 seconds. So these were all 30-second ads, and we look at the aggregate measure across the entire 30 seconds of the ad. So we are not interested in the individual moments. We are not interested in what drives the greatest emotion and so on. We are not trying to compare different copies of an ad, but we are just looking at if the whole ad plays, how was that evaluated and how did that predict the effectiveness of the product in the marketplace, right? And so that's, in some ways it's important because there are other methods that may be better for teasing apart individual temporal components, but not maybe for aggregate data. All right, so this is a busy slide, so I'm going to walk you through it. So what you're going to see on this slide is basically the 14 behavioral measures or self-report measures that we had. So these are things like your familiarity with the commercial, your liking, your excitement. These are a standard battery of questions you would get if anybody was doing creative ad testing using self-report measures. And the other thing here is we work closely with some of the leading people that were doing these kinds of measurements, and we vetted all our questions through them. We asked them, would you like to include any more questions in this? Does this cover the range of questions that you have? So that we were being as thorough as possible when we did this. And what immediately stands out is there is obviously some correlation between all these measures. In other words, like there is some commonalities. People's scores for liking and excitement are always going to be highly correlated. Things stand out like that, right? But this is just behavior. Now I can expand this to throw in all the other measures that we have, right? So if I go to the next slide, the same 14 measures, self-report measures, this is not even the whole grid. So the rows are just the 14 self-report measures, and you have all the possible measures, and again, like it's a restricted one, that you can get from these other methodologies. But the key point, again, I want to make here is that different measures bring different things to the table, right? So some things are highly correlated with self-report measures, which means if you put them together in the same model, they're not going to explain any additional variance. Some things bring something different to the table, and that's where you start explaining additional variance. So the key is understanding what is it that each method brings to the table and how is it useful for the question that you're specifically interested in, right? So how did we approach this? We went back to the literature and we went back to what matters for advertisements. So we came up with the 4 key constructs which everybody uses, which is attention, arousal, affect or emotion, memory, and desirability, right? So if any of you are familiar, the original IDA model started off with something like this in advertisements, so we essentially borrowed from that. And we went back to a literature, so all the things on the right here are academic papers that have used some version of these constructs in advertising context. And what we did is we went and identified the most representative measures for each of these different constructs, right? So basically, so these are all some of the measures, and these are all the references for which papers they are coming from in terms of identifying it, right? So no longer is it that we are calling these like a measure of attention or arousal. The same measure, for example, liking, is used in the literature both to measure attention as well as affect, right? If you like something, that means you feel positive about it, so it's a measure of affect. If you like something, that means you probably paid more attention to it, so it's also a measure of attention. So these measures can be based in multiple buckets too, right? So once we had this, the next part was the dependent variable. So again, we had an entirely different team of people from NYU who were essentially doing this, completely independent from us who were analyzing most of the neuroscience data at Temple. And what they did is they went through this 2 years of time series data that I was talking about, and for each ad tried to estimate what is known as an advertising elasticity. That is, what was the percent change in market share for 1% change in advertising revenue or advertising spend, right? And this had to be customized to the different vendors and brands that we had. So for example, for things like Orbitz, it was really about recall and how much do people remember going to the website. For others, it was really about revenue that's generated. So it was really customized to each of the different brands that we had. And then we came up with some kind of a sales response model where, again, we generated a bunch of the measures based on the previous table. We sent it over to NYU. They had the elasticity data, and they tried to predict essentially what happens in terms of each of these measures, right? So which brings us to the data. Again, the big caveat here is that we had only 37 ads for this. So whatever regressions I'm going to present is restricted to that. But Joe brought up a great point this morning. This is a study that's ripe for somebody else to do if you have the resources and you have more ads that's available. It's the perfect study to try and do in those contexts, right? So the first most important thing is these ads are coming from different brands, and brands have a huge effect on market share. So we control for that. So clearly we see that brands are a significant predictor of elasticities, and so we leave brand always in the model. Next, we introduce self-reports. Basically, the idea here is that everybody is going to ask basic self-report questions when you do any of this. So given that people have been doing this for several decades now, does it have any predictive power? And yes, it does. Above and beyond just controlling for brands, self-report questions, and the strongest in this case was recognition, which is basically a memory measure, but liking was also a significant predictor in the study. And what it shows is that they add to explaining the variance beyond what you can get from just the controlling for brands. Once we had these two in the model, again, because we didn't have a huge amount of degrees of freedom, we didn't want to throw all the measures into the model. So we just added each of the other measures that we had one by one beyond what we already had. And the only thing that significantly improved the variance beyond what we already had was fMRI, and particularly activation in the striatum, right? Again, I want to send you back a little bit to Hilke's presentation from the morning. This is exactly the same region that she was talking about when she was talking about some of the prediction studies, where activity in a specific brain area from a small group of individuals predicts something about what happens at the market level or at the population level. It's the same idea. So there is now at least some kind of a correlation or a consistent finding across 6 or 7 different studies in very different contexts, where we show that some kind of activity in the striatum in response to stimuli predicts how well that's going to do at the population level, right? So quickly to summarize, we basically show a strong relationship between what we measure at the individual level and what happens at the market level. Even though measures like EEG and biometrics were not predictive, remember that we are talking about aggregate data, so it doesn't mean that these measures are not useful, they just serve a different purpose. So places where the temporal aspects are more important, they probably convey more data than looking at aggregate data itself. Or it's also possible that some of these shared a lot of the variance with the behavioral measures that were already in the survey. We had too few degrees of freedom, so we couldn't directly compare these measures against each other in the same model, but it still provides a lot of valuable insights for the field of consumer neuroscience in general, right? Now, I'm going to switch gears and tell you about a newer study that we have been doing, which is along the same theme. It's still on advertising, but now it's no longer video advertising. It's still advertisements. And we are specifically interested in comparing advertisements that are presented physically, as in printed form, versus digital. It's really interesting that when I was walking through my talk with some of the translators this morning, the person was emphasizing to me about how she feels very strongly when she has printed materials and it becomes easy to transcribe. So that provides a good context for what I'm going to show you in the next few slides. All right. So the key question here is all marketing channels, specifically in this case print versus digital, equally effective in reaching out to consumers, right? So let's just think about a hypothetical buying process, right? Let's say this is not an impulse purchase. Let's say it's some kind of a planned purchase. Usually it goes through several stages. First, you identify a need for something. Then you start looking out for information, which includes probably being exposed to some advertisements or seeking information websites and so on. Then probably you sit on it for a while, and then when you are in the store, you may recollect some of the information that you have been exposed to, and then you may decide whether to buy or not, right? So there's often a pause between when you're exposed to the information and when you're actually purchasing the product. Social media is an exception to it, but the more traditional context that I'm talking about in this case. So what we did is we went back to the same basic principles. We tried to look at the 4 key constructs, and we tried to see which stages of these process do these things come into play, right? And essentially what you will realize is attention and arousal are important when you're being exposed to the ad, because if you don't process the ad or you don't pay attention to it, you may not recollect the details at a later point of time. And then after a delay, what's really important is how much of the information do you actually remember, and whether that translates into some kind of an action, whether you end up buying the product or not, right? So that was the key here again. So when this study was done in collaboration with the United States Postal Service, now as Postal Service, they were obviously very interested in knowing the relevance of print still in a highly digital world. So they came to us, but they came to us with a very open mind after the ARF study, and they said, it doesn't matter which way the results are, we just want to know whether we need to change how we do our business. And that was important for us because we don't want to be doing research that's just trying to find one set of results. So they came with open mind, and we were very interested in doing this study too, right? But I usually have a set of slides in a longer talk where I show some of the studies that have been done. But the key here is, again, to understand the limitations of methodologies. Anybody who's done fMRI here would know that exposing people to print materials in fMRI is not an easy job. It's pretty much impossible to actually have somebody browsing through materials when you're lying down in the scanner, right? So when we had to think of the study, we had to make some adjustments in how we would do it, right? So the way we did it, again, we went back to the customer buying cycle and the different stages over there. So what we proposed to do was to break this into 2 phases. The first phase is when you would be exposed to information in a lab, and that's not fMRI, but we get other biometric and eye tracking data. And then the second phase is a week later when we test for memory, and that we did with fMRI. So we are doing recognition memory to see like how well do you engage the different brain systems when you're trying to recollect the information a week later. That was the idea over here. So this was heavily based on the memory and advertising framework. I'll go a little quickly through these slides. So if you have looked at advertising and memory, have a very strong literature. And again, it's based on the 3 phases. So first is exposure or encoding, then you have a retention or consolidation phase, and then you have a retrieval phase. It depends both on the content of the advertisement, how much you remember stuff, as well as the viewer itself or the customer itself. If you don't pay attention or you're not interested or you're on the run, you may not know much, you may not pay attention to much of the details, and as a result, you may not remember much about it, right? And the common framework for this is this idea of associative memory framework, the idea that things are stored in some form of nodes within your memory system, and depending on which node you're activated, all the related things also get retrieved correspondingly. And this could be brand specific nodes where the key is the brand. It could be ad specific, or it could be category specific. You may have a set of nodes that have all relations to a car or beer or whatever it may be. At any given point of time, you may retrieve the details corresponding to that particular category based on the current context, right? So again, there's a lot of literature on this. The thing that we are most interested in is long-term memory and specifically episodic memory. Do you remember the context or the episode when you were exposed to the ad, and can you retrieve that at a later point of time based on cues in the environment, right? So when you're in the store and you know you want to buy a particular product, does it automatically retrieve all the necessary information from that associative network? That's what we are most interested in this. And there's again a lot of well-established literature. Remember, going back to the neural correlates point that I was trying to make, where we really understand the memory systems and how they work in the brain, right? And so there are 4 key players here: the perirhinal, the parahippocampal, the entorhinal cortex, and the hippocampus itself. And these play very specific distinct roles. So the perirhinal and entorhinal are specifically coding for items. Then the parahippocampal is coding more for context, like what surrounds the memory, that's when it's happening, the source and so on. And the hippocampus does the job of integrating these things together, right? So this was the basis for what we were interested in going into the study. We wanted to see, like, are there differences in these brain regions as a function of whether you are exposed to information in print or digital form. All right. So the study, I already went through this, but the details itself, the other key here is we wanted to control for brands and the ad itself, because some ads may be more memorable than other ads. So the way we did this is we counterbalance. So we had a total of 40 ads. Each participant gets exposed to 20 of those ads in print format and 20 of those ads in digital format. But across participants, we flipped the set, which means each of the 40 ads, in half the participants would have been exposed in a print format, in other half the participants would have been exposed in digital format. So when you look at the data, all the data cannot be due to the fact that it's ad specific, because they were equally balanced across all the participants in the study, right? So that's very important again in terms of making sure that your results are due to the fact that it's print versus digital and not something else in the ad that's driving. All right, so these are some examples of ads again, and this is another one. But I also want to show you a little bit of a video with the same ad that shows the kind of differences, and I'll come back to this after you watch the videos, right? So the first video is an example of eye tracking and biometrics in the print format. Let's see if I can find my mouse. So this is digital format, I'm sorry. So digital format, the way we set it up is like, it's like an email client. You've got a set of emails from an advertiser. You click on the email on the left, it opens up the ad on the right. And the size of the ad on the screen is exactly matched to the size of the ad that you get when you're doing it in a print format, right? So it's not just related to differences in size, for example. This is the print, and this is the digital. And then on the next slide, you will see the same ad in a different participant, but in the print format. Again, this is important because this is what I talk about when I say making choices in terms of experimental design. So the way this works, because print, you know, these methods are highly sensitive to motion. So what we had to do was we had to get the feel of the haptic touch, but at the same time, during the exposure, we wanted to minimize movements. So the way we did it is participant has a set of cards available to them. They move one card onto this display board, but when they are viewing the actual ad, they are not touching the ad, right? So there's still some haptic component in your interaction with the ad itself, but when you're actually looking at the ad, you can actually see the fingers come in and then the fingers go out, but in the middle portion, there is no haptic touch. So that way, motion is minimized for a lot of the measures that we are interested in. And we define exposure time as the time from when the hand leaves the frame to the time when the hand comes back into the frame. It may be possible that they started as they are moving it, but we took a conservative estimate for how exposure time is defined in each of these studies, right? And beyond this, we tried our best to control for the settings, the lighting, and so on, and the brightness, and all those things when we were doing these studies. All right. Okay. So what about differences? So we measured brand attitudes during the time that they were exposed to all this information. And the important thing here is, even though all of these are not significant, there is a consistent pattern where digital seems to be better than physical. And I'll come back to this in the second study. So in general, people had slightly more positive attitudes to digital ads, where they tended to like it better. They said they were slightly more familiar with it. And we also calculated like purchase intent change pre and post, and we tried to see whether that varied as a function of whether they are seeing these ads in print versus digital form, right? But when we then try to look for the biometric and other kinds of process data, so on this slide you see that in general, people are spending longer with print ads, and this is with a conservative estimate of just when the hand leaves to when the hand comes back onto the frame. Still, they are spending longer time in those ads, which is also associated with greater number of fixations. But if you try to break it into 3 simple AOIs on how much time was spent on the product, how much time was spent on the brand name, and the third one is everything else. It was not like they spent all the time on the product and ignored everything else. It was proportional. The amount of time spent on each of these things was proportionally lesser in digital compared to print. So if you balanced for the RT, then there's actually no difference. That means out of the total time, they spent an equal proportion of time on the product, similarly on the brand, also in this case. All right. Now, what about some other biometric measures? So in this case, we also had pupil dilation data. So pupil dilation again was significantly higher for print than digital, and this was true even when it was baseline corrected, which means it's not just the fact that it's a different eye tracker and it's a different setting, because what we have is a pre-task where we are getting the pupil values and we are looking at the change in pupil values for each of the methods, and we still see that the change is higher for print compared to digital. And the distance traveled is an interesting eye tracking measure. What it's trying to capture is what's the total amount of distance that you're traveling on the screen when you're being exposed to this ad. So the greater the distance traveled, the more breadth you're processing, more information you're processing from the ad. That's essentially the idea over here. So that also fits with the longer reaction time, which means they're probably generally processing more. But this one is interesting. The dwell time is basically what's the duration of each fixation. So remember, there are fewer fixations, but what you see in digital is each time you fixate on something, you spend longer. So you're doing a little bit more deeper processing, but you're focusing on lesser components in digital, whereas in physical, you're doing more breadth, but maybe more shallow processing, right? So that's key again. And this is also consistent then with the skin conductance data, which shows greater arousal levels for print. But HRV high frequency, this is heart rate measure of high frequency, which is like, think of it as a proxy for deceleration, not acceleration. So higher values here means you're more calm or you're more relaxed. And so it looks like digital people are more aroused, whereas opposite is the print people are more aroused, or another way of thinking about it is on the digital side, people are more calm or process deeper. Whatever little they're processing, they process it more deeply, essentially. All right, now what does all this mean for memory? Okay, so remember there are two phases. All the results I've showed you is during encoding. What happens a week later? About 5 to 7 days later, it's really hard to get it exactly right because of availability of scanner and stuff. So we had a minimum of 5 days and maximum 7 days post-exposure. People come into the lab, and then we show them the same ads. Now, this is a surprise memory test. People knew they were going to come back for an fMRI session, but they just thought, in fact, we did this, and they just thought we were going to repeat the experiment in the scanner, but they didn't know there was going to be a memory test. So when they come into the scanner, we ask them 3 questions for each of the ads. We show the whole ad again, and we ask them, mixed with some proxy ads, which they didn't see, foils, that's the term I was looking for, and we ask them 3 questions. Do you remember seeing this ad? If yes, what format did you see it? Did you see it in print or digital, which is our context or source memory question? And we also ask them, how confident are you with your response, right? Now, the first hindsight is 50-50 thing that happened here is because we showed them the whole ad, they were pretty highly accurate in their recognition. So we had high ceiling responses. So people were 95% above in terms of their responses for both print and digital. So we did not see any behavioral differences in memory because they were pretty high for both. But when we drilled it down more into the actual confidence ratings and so on, what we did find is that participants were more accurate in identifying the source for print, which means they were more confident when they saw something in print, but not so confident when they saw something in digital. And they were also faster. They were much quicker at saying, yeah, I remember that I saw it in print. Whereas for digital, there was more confusion, or the retrieval was not as clear, right? Which brings us back to neural differences. So remember, we had a very nice architecture on how the brain works with respect to memory. And so we were interested in looking at whether there were differences in these common brain regions for print versus digital. So we first localized regions in the brain that showed essentially a source versus item memory difference. And we basically zeroed in on these regions, but these are the key ones here, the parahippocampal and the hippocampus regions. And we looked at whether there was a print versus digital difference in these regions. And what we find, so this is showing print greater than digital, so greater than 0 means we saw greater activations in these regions for print compared to digital, right? So even though there were no behavioral differences in memory, there were consistent differences in the hippocampus and the parahippocampus, where people showed greater activation for print materials than digital materials, consistent with the fact that there was probably a stronger imprint, which gets retrieved when people are trying to recall these episodes at retrieval time in the scanner itself, right? Okay, so the last 2 minutes or so, what I want to say is now, how do we leverage this? So this is an interesting scenario where we did a study, we didn't find behavioral differences in memory, but we saw some interesting neural differences, right? Now this could be argued that it's exploratory. Why is it that it doesn't have a behavioral thing? We had some ideas. We thought that maybe the task was too easy. If you made the task more difficult, maybe you would start seeing behavioral differences. So we took the neural data and we designed a follow-up behavioral study. So we had 73 people I'll just skip this. We had 73 people come back to this lab, same study, but no biometrics, no fMRI, straightforward self-report behavioral study. They were exposed to a set of 48 different ads in phase 1. Everything is similar in this case, except that we didn't do the whole email and stuff. People just saw the ads in Qualtrics. And then the key difference here is we didn't show them the whole ad at retrieval, but we only showed them snippets of the ad. So it looked like this, right? So now this retrieval task is harder because you just don't remember the whole ad. So you have to say whether that snippet or that face was a part of the ad. And then more importantly, you also had to say which ad was it for and what brand was it for, right? So we have 2 additional questions now in addition to just asking people, do you remember seeing this, right? And we specifically tried to break this down into 3 types of snippets, which were either faces, words, or scenes, because there is again a very nice neural difference between each of these different stimuli. So we tried to also see if there were differences based on whether faces are more memorable or scenes are more memorable and so on. Okay, so that's what we did, and what we find now, again, this is attitudes. Again, very similar to the previous study, but now some of the things are becoming more significant, where most of these attitudes seem to favor digital over print in general, right? But what about the memory difference? The key finding is here. Now, when we made the thing more harder, we do see a nice significant difference in terms of just recognition memory, where people remember the snippets or people recognize the snippets more accurately for print ads than digital ads. And that is also true for the brands. So not only do they recognize the snippets, but they also correctly attribute it to the appropriate brand, which is most important, right? It's not important if you just remember a famous celebrity if you can't tell what ad was that celebrity advertising for, right? And that's also better with print. And lastly, the source recognition replicated too. So people were more confident that they saw something in print and more accurate than if they saw something in digital, right? Now, remember that there were a lot of differences. I mean, there was a difference in the exposure time. So can all this memory difference be attributed to exposure time? So we wanted to test that in a regression model. So first, there's a strong effect of format, which is print is better than digital. But the actual snippets did not make a difference, whether it was a scene, word, or face in this case. But when we introduced the time on ad, which we loosely define as engagement, like how much did you engage with the ad, it is a significant predictor of memory, but it still leaves some variance and there is still a strong format effect. So it's not all attributed to the amount of difference in the exposure time. There's something beyond exposure time that's probably driving some of these memory differences. And that's true for all the 3, for brand recognition as well as source recognition too, where time on task does explain some part of the variance, but not all of it. All right? So to summarize, print ads were associated with higher arousal, generally processed for longer, but digital ads were processed shorter but more systematically. But print leads to stronger brand associations as well as context encoding. The other thing is, in terms of action, at least in both these studies, we did not see any of this translate into any differences in willingness to pay. In one study, we saw some differences in VMPFC, but again, we were not sure because it was sub-threshold, so it's something that we need to do more work on. But for anybody who does this, willingness to pay differences are also really hard to get in the lab because there's a lot of heterogeneity in people's ratings and how much they're willing to pay for all of this, right? So in terms of some future work, one of the things that we are looking at, and we have some data, but it's still preliminary, is we're looking at effects of age or cohorts, like do millennials who are more exposed to digital differ from baby boomers who are more exposed to print format? So that's something that we are looking at. how does this extend based on people's brand loyalty and brand associations? Like what role does that play? And also what I didn't talk about is the content of the ad itself. Like what are some things that you can vary there? So we're varying 3 different types of ads: ads that are purely functional, ads that speak to your emotions, and ads that are considered metaphorical, which means you have to interpret the ad in order to understand the message it's conveying. And we are trying to see how do these different types of ads change the understanding of how things work. All right, thank you. And just a plug here, Joe was talking about conferences. So there's another conference that we try to organize with similar kind of an idea, which is the Interdisciplinary Symposium on Decision Neuroscience. It's not too far on the neuroeconomic side. It's not too far on the world neuromarketing side, but it's probably still a bit more heavier on the academic side. But the goal of that, if you read the thing, is to provide an opportunity for people from the industry and the business side to mingle with academics without having to worry about what you're presenting and so on. So again, the next one will be at Temple in June. More information will be forthcoming, but I just wanted to provide it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinod. Do we have questions? For the moment, there are no slide of questions. Okay, then let me maybe start with the first question. I have 2 questions for you. The first one is a bit not only relating to your own research on the prediction, and maybe to give some background for the question, at the first meetings at the Society for Neuroeconomics, there was this fight over, is it the VMPFC, is it a nucleus accumbens? And you know, I think we were within the same camp on this point, but so then luckily there was this meta-analysis showing both regions are involved, but now what seems to be in some ways a common thread is that the nucleus accumbens is better at the market level prediction, although there's Emily's work that shows also for the VMPFC predicts quitting smoking hotline numbers. And so the question I've always wondering is, why do you think on the market level it looks like it might be more the nucleus accumbens? And in these studies, given that you're one of the pioneers doing these studies, how do we correct for the size of the region? Because obviously the nucleus accumbens is much smaller, so there will be much less variation than in the VMPFC. And so what are your thoughts on this?
Great questions again. I think I will, I mean, I've talked to Alex and Brian a lot on this too, because they have a lot more data on the forecasting stuff especially. I think like my view, which is not very different from their view on this, is the dissociation between striatum and VMPFC comes a little bit from how much of the deliberation comes into the picture. So I actually like, I was talking to Joe before about this, I like Alex's analogy that he uses. Imagine someone walked into this room with a fresh tray of cookies or some dessert that you really like, right? Your first response is going to be dictated by how attractive that tray is, how well it smells, and so on. But later, you bring other things into the process. But I already had dessert today at lunch, or I'm dieting now and I don't want to eat that, right? So there is a difference, and usually what we have seen in a lot of the studies is the valuation component, particularly the VMPFC, is integrating all of those different signals together, right? So what we find in a lot of the forecasting studies is VMPFC predicts signals within the sample, so it predicts individual differences and stuff really well on what people are going to do. But the striatum seems to predict out of sample much better than the VMPFC, because maybe one option is it's capturing that true first signal, pleasure signal or desire signal, that is not confounded by all of these other factors that you're bringing into the table, right? So that's one thought, but I don't think it needs to be the striatum again. I think Ala Smith's group at Erasmus has some data with movie trailers where they actually find that some of the prediction signals come from the temporal regions. Now, I think that's because what's really important as the first mutual signal may vary based on the type of stimuli, right? So in ads, we are trying to capture something about desirability because that's our DV. Same thing with a lot of Brian studies where they are asking for crowdfunding decisions, willingness to pay, and so on. But if you look at temporal signals like movie trailers and stuff, maybe it's the visual component and the integration of the visual and auditory components that are more important, which means that signal may not be in the striatum, but maybe in some of the temporal regions, right? So if we believe in this consistency theory and what is the first signal that's across a sample of people, it may be distributed in the brain. It doesn't have to be the striatum always.
Second question, so which relates to this. In some ways, and maybe we need to go back to this during the roundtable, which is kind of the left side of this equation, what you're trying to predict. So in the first study, your DV, your dependent variable, is advertising elasticity as a measure of advertising effectiveness. Second study, you look at memory. And I think it's a bit also a question for all of us in the field of marketing, what is advertising effectiveness? And so yeah. I guess my first question, we can maybe go back to this at the roundtable also, is so in your second study where you more look at memory, can you follow up your stimuli and see which will result in more sales or not? Or yeah. Is that something that will be difficult?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, but I don't see it as much as a problem as an important factor for people to remember that all these measures are at the service of the question that you're asking, right? So when you go into a study, you really need to know what is it that you want from it. For example, what is the focus for an ad in a Super Bowl may be very different from a general ad, because in a Super Bowl you want that one bang, you want to get enough memory or attraction out of it, and that's it. You probably don't care about what happens later, right? So the DV actually, I mean, for us, it's about convenience, what data we have access to and what is it that we can study, similar to what Joseph was saying earlier. But as an academic or a practitioner, I think it's key, I mean, as a client or industry person, it is key for you to know exactly what is it that you're interested in, and based on that, identify which measures are suitable for answering the questions that you're interested in. For example, if you want to test 2 copies of an ad where you want to change one particular scene, then maybe things like biometrics work very well, because it can tell you differences at a given time point between 2 different signals, right, which may not be so well captured with fMRI. So again, I think like, I mean, in some ways, these were not meant to be follow-up studies. These were 2 completely different studies from different sponsors, but they do have the common theme of advertising, nothing more than that, I think. Yeah.
Now there are lots of questions popping up. So the first one, maybe, let me start with one. I want to know more about EEG. I think you started already answering this. It's a bit like, what do you want to know? Do you want to talk more about this?
Yeah, so in this study, so EEG was one measure that we didn't collect in-house. So we did have another academic partner who collected the EEG data for it. So we were limited in what we were doing, but again, we used the most common ones that people use, which is basically the frontal alpha asymmetry and also the visual gating. So basically to capture attention in terms of like what the gating signals are. If you just forget everything else and assume that there's no self-reports, some of these EEG measures actually predict elasticities. But when you put them together with some of the self-report measures, they are probably capturing the same variance, and so we don't see differences in what we are doing, right? And again, the second plug for EEG here is, again, EEG has much stronger temporal resolution. So for things where you're not collapsing the data across all the 30 seconds, EEG might provide you much better insights than fMRI again.
And then there's a question about how you modeled at elasticities, actually. So how is the seasonality, category effect, and so forth?
Yeah, I think I need more time than like 1 or 2 minutes to explain that. But the basic idea is these were split into both long-term and short-term elasticities. And essentially what it did is took a lot of confounding variables into account, like what competitors were out there, how many times were these ad only in TV format, or were they also had social media equivalents, and all of these things were controlled for individually specifically for each of the ads before coming out with an elasticity value. And I believe like it's standard market response modeling based on how it's done, market mix model.
And then, so do you think this is specific for whether I'm a first buyer or a repeated buyer?
That's a good question. So in all of this, none of this is novel in terms of exposure to the ad. In the first study, we specifically wanted ads that ran 2 years ago because we wanted the elasticity data. So people were definitely familiar. We do ask people whether they have bought the product or they own the product, and I don't think it co-varied with any of our results. But I don't think we have explicitly tested to see whether whether if it's a repeat purchase or whether some of how they react to these ads would be different. I believe there would be some differences because that goes back to the characteristics of the consumer when I said like how effective a still ad is at least, because if you already know the product, maybe you're not paying as much attention to the ad the second time around because you already know something about it. But we haven't tested it for sure.
Last question. So do you think that the difference between print and digital that you find are really based on people's different experiences? Like you kind of motivated also the talk that the translator had to touch the slides to better get into this?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's important because that's not going to change, right? So when you are exposed to this information, you are clearly going to handle print information in a certain way that you're never going to handle digital information, right? So that's again the tension between internal external validity that I was talking about. We want to make sure that it's as close as possible to what happens in the real world. We don't want to have an experimenter that's putting the cards in front of you because that's not what usually happens. But at the same time, we are also aware of what are the limitations of some of these methodologies and how can we work within those limitations. Today, the technology has improved. We did this study about 5 or 6 years ago. Now you have much better ways of collecting some of this data, and so maybe you would be able to do it in a more natural setting. But it was definitely not the case when we first ran the study.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So without further ado, we now